Welcome to this session, Music Teaching the Language of Sound. My name is Sean Dingley. I'm the Director of Music at Ridgeway Education Trust. Ridgeway Education Trust is a small trust of 2 secondaries and a primary school based in Didcot, which is just south of Oxford. We're comprehensive schools, and we've got a girls' school and a boys' school and a sort of a comprehensive primary school. And the things I'm going to be talking to you today about are based around my experience of working in that context. A little bit of housekeeping just to get us started. Please ensure that you've muted. I think I've just muted everybody, but just if you do, we do have a bit of time for discussion, then just make sure you're muted afterwards. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free just to raise your hand or use the chat facility. Please feel free to interrupt me and ask me any questions that you would like to. I can just about see the chat. Sometimes the chat disappears. Hi, Alison. It's fantastic to have you. Thank you. The chat disappears, so I might miss some of the chat, but if your hand goes up, I'll definitely be able to see that and I will stop. There will be the opportunity for discussion also. This is a slightly longer presentation. We're going on to 1:20, but there'll be a longer period at the end for us to discuss the things that I'm going to raise with you today. So this this presentation is all about how do we teach the language of sound. And what I'm going to do during this presentation is talk about a number of things. First of all, the problem. What do I see as the problem? What are the barriers to teaching music today? I'm going to go through a number of things. I'm not going to cover every single thing because we haven't got time to do that, but we'll go through a few things that I think are an issue. And then I will also talk about why it's important for us to change this. The why for me is always really, really important. When we're discussing about why music and sound is so important, it's really, we must have the justification for that, because people who don't necessarily understand will not understand that justification unless we explain it to them. We're going to talk about the solutions. So how do we effectively teach music and about how sound works? And also what are the wider social things that we perhaps need to start thinking about, and what things can we start to enact? So a little starter for you to begin with. So I want you to imagine a sound. I want you to imagine any sound. It can be a musical sound or any other type of sound. What I want you to do is try to explain that sound to somebody who has never heard it before. Okay. Now, the difficulty, and I think the challenge I'm going to put to you here, is you are not allowed to use any other sound as reference. So you can't say it sounds like this or it sounds like that. You have to describe the sound in a way that they will understand without saying, oh, it sounds like a helicopter, or it sounds like this. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, and then I'll see if we've got anyone who's brave enough to see if they want to have a go at that. Hopefully got your thinking faces on. Give about another minute, and then anybody who's willing, if you want to type it in the chat rather than say anything out loud, then feel free to do so. You can share it, just share with me, but I will ask for some contributions if anybody is willing to do so. Okay, is anyone willing to have a go at this? Anyone willing to try to explain it without referring to sound directly? I can't see. Oh, gone too far forward. Let's go back to there. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong buttons. Go on, Ruth.
Okay, at this point I want to put my camera off. Okay, if you shape your lips into a circle, as small a circle you can, and exhale with, are we allowed to say the letter B at the beginning of it? That's assuming somebody has some language skills.
Yeah.
Or listeners, see, and use the letter B to start it. Can you then exhale with a sound but starts with a B?
Very good. I like that. I mean, it's interesting that you've made reference there to that they have to have some knowledge of some other sound. They have to know what a bus sounds like. And yeah, interesting. Great. Thanks, Ruth. That's really helpful. Does anybody else like to have a go? So, also, Alison has typed in the chat, when something hard is constantly moving out against other surfaces, rattles in our camper van. Yeah, yeah. So again, it's that really difficult concept, and there we go. Got a couple of them coming in now, which is great. So yes, I completely agree, Alison. Yeah, you can talk about that you're making reference to something happening, and therefore, but in order for them to really understand what that would sound like, they would have had to have experienced that previously, I think. So that's an interesting concept, that one. Have they ever heard the rattle in the camper van, and would anyone be able to describe your rattle in your camper van without actually having experienced it? Kat's put one in there. It goes from high to low, and it's breath out and a feeling of disappointment. So yeah, sorry, you can only see the bit that I can see. I'm just reading out the things that I've got to you. Sorry, Ruth. So yes, that's another one. Again, I think, as Kat, you put there about high and low, it's interesting, what's their perception of high and low? Is somebody's high, is it the same? How high is it? It's, yeah, challenging. So this is my problem. And this is the problem that I think we all experience in music, is actually very, very difficult to explain sound using words. It is all subjective. It all requires some knowledge of other sound. And this causes us a problem. We want students to have an understanding of how sound works. The reason for this is every day we are influenced by music and sound, and it makes us think and feel in particular ways. The fact that, when you listen to an advert or to a program or to a film, that you get a particular mood or emotion which comes from the music. We are affected by that and think in that way, but we don't necessarily always, not everybody understands why that is. It is therefore really essential that we make sure that our young people have at least a basic understanding of sound, so that they understand how they and why they are being affected in particular ways. The problem we've got is that due to a lack of perhaps this type of musical education over a number of years, over generations, the parents that we've got today don't necessarily have the expertise to be able to introduce students to how this sort of level of how music works. Most of the parents that I ever talk to say to me, I don't understand music. I don't get music. I'm not musical at all. And so therefore they never try. And that very basic concept of that very early introduction to music then doesn't happen. The first time that really students sometimes are introduced to music is when they get to primary school. So let's have a think about other mediums and how we would teach those. So if we think about other language mediums, I've used language, I'm talking about language here, by the way, inverted commas, because whether or not you just define all of these things as language, it doesn't matter. So I've used language because I haven't got a better word for it. If we're thinking about speaking, writing, reading, any kind of body language, image, number, color, any of these sorts of things, teaching these things is relatively simple, because if I wanted to tell you that this is a hot water bottle, it just happens to be on my desk here. If I point to it, I can say hot water bottle, okay? If I wanted to tell you that this pen is green, I could point to it and go green. If I wanted to tell you something like, oh, the sky is blue, I point at the sky, okay, sky is blue. All of these things are taught in multiple forms. They're taught in word, so we use the spoken or the written word, and we can also use the sound of it as well, or the actual thing that we're looking at or listening to. That isn't necessarily true in music. It's much more difficult to point at sound. You can't just sort of point to something and go, okay, that music there, that's this thing here, because it may be happening in multiple layers of other sounds occurring at the same time. It would be a bit like having several layers of color on the sort of acetate and saying, what is the third layer down? What color is it? It'd be very, very difficult to pick that out without actually peeling back the layers of those different acetate layers of color until you get to that layer and say, actually, okay, it's that one there. We, of course, do have this kind of association with a notation in music. However, lots of music is not notated, and we could point at a piece of notation and go, that's D, but that doesn't work. What you'd actually have to go is, okay, point at that note D, and then so they get the sound, because there's actually another layer of learning that has to go on there. To associate that thing that's written down as a note of D, they probably want to hear it. And the difficulty we have here is that most parents don't necessarily have the musical knowledge to be able to do that. They wouldn't be able to look at a sound and go, okay, that's that written down. It doesn't work. It's also impossible to describe sound without knowledge of other sound. We've just discovered during that little starter activity, we need to have some form of knowledge there, otherwise it just won't work. And of course, interpretation of sound is very different. The way we hear things is different. I always use the major minor explanation here. Some people hear minor as sad, some people hear it as dark, some people hear it in all different ways. And so when we're trying to describe it that way around, it doesn't necessarily work very well. So this is the problem that we're facing. We don't have the expertise within parents when they're teaching young people to be able to introduce sounds very early on. So what we're going to do is have a think about some possible solutions. I'm going to introduce three things to you. One in significant detail, the other two very briefly, because I think the last two we have a limited influence on. First thing, how we teach it when they come into school. So I'm going to talk from a school perspective and how I would teach it. I'm also going to talk about how I would teach it as a parent. The second thing, we need to get more music playing and singing to our young people as early as possible. So young people need to be engaging with music as soon as it is physically possible to do so. And how we go about doing that is really important. And the final thing is we need to break the cycle of minimal musical education. The only way that we are going to make any change to anything that we do is by making sure that our young people today are educated enough in music so that when they are parents, they can begin to educate their children. So the kind of changes here we're talking about are generational changes. So how do we teach music in school? So I'm going to show you a model that I use when I'm teaching musical concepts in school, and I share it with my department, and it's worked really well in my department. It's worked in other departments that I work with, and I'm also using it for my children. The caveat here is that I am assuming that students are experiencing music in other ways outside of the format that I'm about to tell you. This is not an isolation thing. It's not, okay, this is the only thing we're going to do. We are going to do things in a range of ways, including music making, singing, some form of playing, creating music. This is just one small part of their musical education. So this is my little solution here. Was my solution. This is my model that I use. There are 5 stages to this. I've given them these names for the purposes of explaining it and giving it a little title, but the names are not necessarily that important. Got listen, engage, define and explain, participate, apply, and expand. And the first step here is listen and engage. The first thing that we need students to do if we're trying to show them a concept or a sound, or young people, is for them to hear it. This is one of the most common errors that happens with particularly young teachers or very inexperienced teachers, is they try to explain the sound before people have actually heard the sound. The students haven't heard the sound. And therefore, that means that what you are doing is explaining your interpretation of the sound, but the students have no idea what you're talking about. As we've encountered, as I said earlier, I have no idea what the caravan rattling is going to sound like. The best way to explain it to me is to play me a recording of it. Okay. This should be in multiple forms. So they should listen to the sound. So we need to hear the overall sound, the overall music that we are listening to. And they should engage with the sound in some way. I recommend that one of the things that they should do is take that sound in isolation. So if you were listening to some music and you wanted to identify to students that it is minor or uses minor chords, what I would do is take away all the other layers of all the other things, and I would just play to them the chords, so that they can hear exactly what it is that I am talking about. If you're playing multiple layers of other music, you just don't know that they are listening to the thing that you want to them to listen to. They might be listening to the melody, they might be listening to the instrument that's being played on, they might be listening to the rhythm, they might be not listening to anything at all. They might be listening to the words if it's a song. It's very difficult to know exactly what they're listening to because you can't point to it. You can't say you're listening to this particular thing here. You need to take it out in isolation first. So that's the thing I would do. Play it in isolation, take out the singular thing that you want them to identify. The next step is to define and explain it. So what is it? What is it that we're listening to? What are we trying to talk about here? Use some words now. Say, okay, I'm assuming they know about chords at this stage. Okay, I've got a series of chords here that sound like this. These are minor chords. At this stage, I would recommend asking them and also thinking about what it feels like and sounds like to me. So what does it sound like to you? We'll get the right one. Compared to perhaps using major as a reference if you've done that previously. What does it actually sound like? And explain or interpret it. So to me, minor chords sound dark. They sound sort of slight, perhaps a bit mournful, those kind of things, but it might sound slightly different to you. I might also use a visual representation of the concept at this stage. So if it's appropriate, especially if it's melody, maybe some form of notation, maybe some boxes and some lines, maybe some dots for rhythm, some visual things so you can look at it and point at the concepts, particularly if you've been using that concept previously. Making sure that they have their own interpretation of this sound is really important. If they're trying to listen to how you interpret it, they might identify the wrong thing. So they might say, oh, it sounds sad to me. But then when they hear this, still sounds quite sad, but it's not minor, it's major. And we get that misconception happening all the time. So making sure they have their own interpretation. So we isolate it and define it. The next stage should be them engaging with this sound. They should participate, use, play, create using this kind of sound, this concept, so that they can really engage with how it works and what it does. This is what will often be a practical activity. So it might be that, if you're learning a scale using the pentatonic scale, okay, right, go away. You're going to use these 5 notes. You're going to go away and create yourself a little melody using these 5 notes only. Oh, we're doing minor chords, right? Okay, so you're going to go and create a chord sequence that only uses minor chords. Okay, we're doing syncopation. What I want you to do is go away and create a rhythm that uses syncopation. This is also a good checking phase, because if they go away and you told them to write a melody that is pentatonic and they come up with a melody that's not pentatonic, then you know that they've not understood what the concept is. So you can go back to the previous stages and say, well, actually, what we're looking at is a pentatonic scale. It only has 5 notes. You've actually used 7 notes. That's not pentatonic. Therefore, we need to make sure we're only using the 5. So please, could you make sure you're using the 5, and then checking back. By creating and using it and engaging with it, they will help their memory to remember it. If you just explain the concept to them, there's no way that they're going to remember it unless they constantly come back to it. If they play something, you can then say to them, oh, do you remember that time that you created the melody that sounded like this? Much more likely to remember it. They then need to check whether they can actually hear it. So once we've explained it, they've engaged with it, can they identify that concept in a musical example? So you would play them a melody that makes use of the pentatonic scale. Okay, what type of scale does it use? Okay, how many notes does it have? It has 5. Okay, so what do we call that? It's the pentatonic scale. So they can apply it in isolation first of all. And then the final stage is they can expand on it and play them lots of different pieces, get them to identify that it is the pentatonic scale at that point, listening to the melody line. This then happens over time. So one of the Rosenshine principles is this constant practice. So this needs to come back, and that's where this expand comes in. So this lesson or next week or whenever you're next going to speak about it, okay, do you remember this? Do you remember what it was called? Right, what can you hear going on here? So these are my 5 kind of steps, and they can be quite adaptable. Sometimes things might be swapped around slightly. It might be that before we get to define and explain, we might do some participation. If you're doing some group performance, for example, with syncopation, I might have done some participation with that first of all. I might have got the whole class to be clapping syncopated rhythms without them really realizing that they are doing that. And then I would explain it afterwards. So that bit can be swapped around. So therefore it comes as part of that listen engage stage. So actually the listening could become part of that, and they could actually perform and engage there also. So we've got listen, engage, define, explain, participate, apply, and expand. Those are my 5 steps for creating or for demonstrating musical sound. So that's our, so this is the example. I've already talked about this. So, we've talked about major minor chords already, and I've talked about through that process. So I'm not going to go through that bit at the moment, but this PowerPoint will come out at the end. So if you wanted to take this as an example, then please feel free to do so. So the points that I really wanted to come to focus on here is that sound comes first. Students have to know what the sound is before we try to explain it. They have to have heard the sound, they have to engage with the sound, they need to really understand what the sound is before we go anywhere near any kind of explanation. We do that first. What we will say is it sounds like this. And if we say that, we're on a kind of fighting a losing battle. They have to engage with it musically, especially novice learners, because they don't have the depth of musical knowledge to be able to understand a concept without this. It's a bit like language. We're teaching language or number. There's no way of us really saying number, or, you know, what's the number 3? Okay, right. So number 3 is the number 3. The thing that we would do with young novice learners is put 3 things in front of them and count 1, 2, 3. That's what number 3 is. It gives us that link and gives us that physical link to it, so that we know, okay, right, this is what 3 means, because a number otherwise is just a concept we can't understand. So here are my other solutions. So concepts, these other 2 things are problems that I talked about. We need to get music singing into our young people as soon as possible. Imagine a world where all schools had access to decent instruments and decent playing for the whole of a student's education. What would be the outcome by the time they get to music A level? I know that is a bit of a pipe dream at the moment, really. And I know all of you are going there, you know, so, well, if only. But that shouldn't be an if only. That's not something that is ridiculously difficult to do. We recently bought a set of keyboards for our primary school. We bought a set of keyboards with batteries and the power packs, and it cost us in total about £1,200. That £1,200 is going to last them, that investment, probably for about 8 years, and we might need to start replacing some keyboards at some point. So we're talking about £1,200 for every primary school. I'm assuming secondary schools have some form of decent instruments, but £1,200 for every primary school for over 8 years. That's not a great deal of money, but it doesn't happen at the moment for lots of different reasons. Things like storage, things like lack of people expertise in teaching, those sorts of things. But imagine if every student did have access to that, what a fantastic musical world we would have. What about, in addition to something like Book Start? Hopefully you've all heard of Book Start. It's a scheme where young children are given books when they're very young, so that they have opportunity for reading at home, to make sure that every student, every young person has books at home. Music Start, every toddler is provided with some form of musical instrument to play with. The reason I mention this is my toddler, who is definitely a very much a three-nager at the moment, absolutely loves sitting at the piano and pressing keys, and he is beginning to identify G sharp, F sharp, and A sharp, because he presses the key and goes, "What's this?" And we say A sharp, and he goes A sharp in the repetition way. Imagine if all of our students had that kind of education very early on. I am very advantaged because I am a music teacher and I am a musician and I have instruments at home. I am in an advantaged position. There are many students out there, many children who don't have that access. What if we had a system that gave them that access? Breaking this cycle of more musical education. I, again, am very fortunate because I am musically trained. I can explain to my children, okay, what you're listening to there is this, it's this, da 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 da, whatever it might be. I can sing it to them, I can play it to them, and then when they go, "What's that?" I can say, "That's a violin," and "What's that?" "That's a double bass." I can identify those things because I have had a decent musical education. Majority of parents can't do that. So the only way we break this is by giving students a really good musical education now, so that when they become parents, they are able to do those sorts of things. And then their children are able to do those sorts of things, and their children are able to do those sorts of things. Without that, we're not going to get very far. We need to get music education into primary schools as early as possible and regularly, to make sure that we do have those things. I imagine that because I'm talking to, and all of you are here listening to this particular presentation, that I'm preaching to the converted, and I don't need to tell you that. But it is a point to be making to any leaders or any kind of politicians. You know, the only way we break the cycle of minimal music education is by giving better musical education to our children. That is the point of doing it. So it is now just about 5 past. In the last 15 minutes are questions and reflections time. So I'm opening the floor to you now. If you have any questions, oh, sorry, I've missed the chat. I'm going to go back to the chat. I couldn't see that those appearing. Let me see if I can change the settings so everyone can read it. So you should be able to chat with everybody now. So I'm just going to go through some things that people have said there. Georgia says, I think feeling comes into explanation, physical feeling combined with emotion. I completely agree. Musical things provoke an emotional response, and that is why our interpretation of them is very different. I have a student in my year 9 class that if I was to play them this, she physically cringes. You can see that she twitches, and the rest of the room now know that she does that. So every time we talk about dissonance, and I end up playing something like this, they all look at her because she has a physical reaction to that dissonance, a reaction that none of the other class have. They have all very different reactions. You can see some of them going, oh, after a bit of time, but it's all very different. So I completely agree, Georgia. Thanks, Kat. I missed that because I work with a relation on different instruments too. Yes, I completely agree that in primary schools we should have different instruments. The keyboards are just an example. Yes, and Ruth, I completely agree that we need the teachers to deliver music, and we need to be helping primary school teachers with that expertise. Secondary teachers are full of expertise because we are music specialists and we often have music degrees, but primaries don't have that. There needs to be an issue at teacher training, really. I know that most primary teacher training courses have maybe one session of music for their training course, maybe a couple. The ones that I've spoken to, perhaps that's something we need to expand. Yes, there we go, Kat. You just said exactly what I was mentioning there. Music training to the PGC course for primary school teachers, definitely. I think it's a massive part. If we think about the subjects which they are least familiar with, languages, so French, German, and music are probably most teachers, primary school teachers' weakest areas. So there should be more time dedicated to those things to make sure that their subject knowledge is really good. I wish there were free music lessons for all preschoolers. I wish there were free music lessons for everybody all the way up. There's no reason why not cats. I think that's apart from money, it'd be great to have all of that. Does anyone have any questions at all? I'm going to come out of that because then I can see everything a bit better. People appearing in the waiting room. Any other questions? Any other reflections? Anyone think, okay, that I would potentially do that a different way, or anyone think, okay, I don't.
Actually, yes, it's Georgia speaking. Let me just put my video on. Thank you so much, Sean. Hi there. A thought that's just gone through my mind is that, in days gone by, at the centre of the communities, whether people are religious or not, they would have gathered in church and sung together as families. And I think that that's a massive thing that's been lost largely now. And so, in fact, children would have grown up with singing being, part of their weekly lives out of school. And yeah, I just wanted to say that really, because I think that was such an important element to community, family, and to self.
It's interesting that, isn't it? I completely agree. My grandparents lived in a religious community in Dorset, and they had a church just opposite their house, and they would go and sing, and that's where my family's kind of musical love has come from, really. My grandpa was an organist, and so I completely understand that difficulty of losing that. But it's interesting that Wales and Welsh communities, even without perhaps religion, still retain a lot of that singing culture. In England in particular, I think we've got into a place now where people consider themselves not singers, and they are distinctly not singers. Some of that has come from music education at school when parents were at school. And I've heard so many stories where parents said to me, when I was at school, there's a choir, and they went along the line and got each person to sing. And they got to me and I sang, and they said, you don't sing, you go elsewhere. And we still have that culture today in things like the X Factor or Britain's Got Talent. This conundrum that, this presentation that you've got excellent singers that I'll go on to the next round, and then you've got terrible singers. You don't have anything in between. All of the middle ground that would be there would disappear. And this thing that in order to be and enjoy music, you have to be good at music. That's the thing that really irritates me all of the time. It's like, the fact that you are not a professional singer does not mean that you cannot enjoy participating in music. It should not be a thing that only the best get to experience the thing and enjoy it. So there's a culture there. I think there's a cultural shift that we need societally, in that we want people to enjoy singing without feeling the need to be expert singers, and also for them to stop telling their children that they are a terrible singer. I just always times, you know, I had one, my parents' evening is always painful when with year 7 and 8, when the parent turns to their child and says, oh yeah, you sing in the shower all the time, it's awful. And I just die a little inside every time that happens, because it's just that constant little comment that just means that child's now going to grow up and not going to sing to their children because they're worried about the fact that they're not a good singer. It's devastating, really.
Yeah, and I think that's where the emotion comes in, where I said I really believe in that so much, because whenever I've sung with anybody, children, adults, I've always said to them, if you are feeling the emotion, then you are singing. That's it, full stop. The tune is secondary. And that's it, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, completely agree. I always I make a really big point to my Key Stage 3 assessment that at no point ever in any of our assessments, we do quite a lot of singing at Key Stage 3 in different projects. It never says about high quality singing. It says about singing with good technique. But the fact that it is the quality of the voice, whether it's in tune, is not a factor that we assess with students directly. We'll never say to them, you need to be more in tune, because that's not what we're trying to weigh. And we're trying to talk about good net singing. Are they standing correctly? Are they breathing correctly? Generally, if they're doing those things, they're going to be in tune anyway. And then we can, sort of with individual students, kind of just correct those tiny things that might be making them out of tune. Like, you know, for example, the vowel sounds, you know, they're going ah rather than ah, and so they're giving a different sound. That's very easy to fix. But, you know, turning around to them saying you're out of tune, that's not going to be beneficial to anybody. So yeah, I think small gains there, isn't it, really? Good question. Does anyone, Ruth has just put a thing in there. Had experience with a Key Stage 3 and 4 SEN school where the sound recording engineer cut off the pitch matching, and that was what had made me the most proud.
I was furious. Absolutely furious, because we'd worked with phrases, and we had some who were non-verbal, who actually just showed me whether it was high or low, and all sorts of things. And we'd managed to get a choir together. We also had people who students who were so much on the autistic spectrum that I'd just hand them rhythm cards and they would sort out the rhythm of the song while I wasn't looking, obviously. But the rest of the choir, we actually had got 3-part singing, and I was so excited. And the sound engineer cut off the off you go, everybody sing me this note first. And it was a bit, I mean, it wasn't the whole point of it. The point of it was to sing, to have everybody involved, including some Ofsted inspectors at the back once, when I said, somebody at the back's not singing. And the 3 of them, I was clearly like a witch, and they stood up and went, oh, sorry, we'll join in. I thought, good. But I was so unimpressed by the sound engineers who cut off the fact that we'd worked on listening to a pitch, and whether it was down there or whether it was up here, it didn't matter. The point was that they'd worked on it, and it just wasn't valued enough.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry. It's really tricky, though, isn't it?
And sound engineers, their job is to make it as good as possible. You know, that's and so we have this perception. And I always, year 9, we start GCSE in year 9. When we start talking about Queen and Killer Queen, and we talk about recording, and I show them actually that you can record the same thing several times and take the best kind of millisecond from each one, and they'll go. And I say, look, what you're listening to is not what you're listening to. You're listening to several takes often of the same thing, where there's been adjustments to it to make it sound what it is. Even when they're performing live, they're going to have some form of adjustment to it. It's not a true representation of what they sound like. I love the acoustic kind of recordings that people do, the live acoustic things, where actually you generally hear a better sound, hear a more authentic sound, and it sounds so different to their recorded version, which we have a thing that has to be polished, it has to be perfect, it has to be absolutely amazing. And the whole of this concept, the whole of these presentations today about, you know, art is never perfect. It never can be perfect, because it's perfect for one person but it's not perfect for another. I hate those perfect recordings because they don't sound real to me. They don't sound like music. They sound like really heavily edited and organized sound. That's not what I really enjoy. I love listening to the sound of a choir, particularly an a cappella choir, just the sound of the voices just very naturally kind of blending together. That's what makes me tick. That's what makes me want to do what I want to do, is that sound. And when you start editing it and playing with it, it completely ruins it. So that interpretation of perfection is very, very subjective.
Can I share something with you that I did in one school? And this was not for high quality music experience. This was absolutely, firstly and foremost, for breaking down the barriers of lack of confidence amongst staff and pupils. It was a whole school singing assembly that we started up once a week, and it was karaoke. And it was pop songs, which the children loved. It was about breaking down the barriers and handing that microphone round. And within a term, every child had the confidence to hold that microphone for a phrase or a line, and the staff interacted. We passed it around as we felt fit on any one morning, and it was absolutely tremendous for confidence building. Then the music teaching was able to follow in its more conventional way, but that was just amazing, and I recommend it.
It sounds brilliant. Yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing that I love. Is, just literally that can really open, kind of everybody just singing to their top of their lungs for no one really singing, like nobody's listening. That's the ideal. Okay, it is 17 minutes past. So at this stage, we're just going to wrap things up. So if I am a specialist leader of education as part of the Oxfordshire Teaching School Alliance. If you ever think, actually, I would quite like to do some more work, we provide one-to-one help to schools and to other organisations. So we are, you're more than welcome to be in contact and just say, look, what do you think about this? I'm happy to look at things and look at schemes of work and things. So actually, what would you do here, or could I have a second opinion? Please feel free to pop us an email. What I will do is I'll just put my email address in the chat for you now, so that you can do that. I'd love to hear of any kind of plans or kind of educational things that you've got that work. It would be lovely to use some of those in our own trust and with the trust and the other schools that I work with. And also feel free to shoot me any questions afterwards also, because we're running out of time. Do enjoy your lunchtime and also enjoy the rest of the sessions this afternoon. And thank you very much for joining us on such a sunny day when we could all be outside. Thanks, everybody.